The bear wouldn't stop knocking on the police station door. When the officers finally followed him, the truth left them in tears. The wind howled through the small mountain town, whistling between the wooden beams of the police station. Officer Emily Carter sipped her lukewarm coffee, settling into the quiet rhythm of the early morning shift. Calls were rare at this hour, usually a lost pet or a deer wandering too close to the highway. Today seemed no different. The dim light of dawn stretched long shadows across the frost-covered streets. Leaning back in her chair, Emily listened to the static hum of the radio, her boots propped up on the desk as she scrolled through an old case file. Across from her, Officer Jake flipped through a newspaper, the rustling pages the only real sound in the room, aside from the rhythmic tapping of Carla, the dispatcher, idly clicking her pen against the counter. Then came the knock. It was firm, deliberate, unexpected. At first, Emily thought she had imagined it, just the wind rattling the door in just the right way. Then it came again, louder this time. 3 distinct knocks. She exchanged a glance with Jake, who raised an eyebrow and set his newspaper down. "Bit early for visitors, don't you think?" he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. Emily stood as well, curiosity piqued. Moving toward the door, she hovered her hand over the handle, hesitating only briefly before pulling it open. She expected to see a local resident bundled in winter gear, maybe someone needing directions or shelter from the cold. Instead, she found herself staring into the deep, intelligent eyes of a massive brown bear. Time seemed to slow. The world narrowed. Cold air rushed into the station, but Emily barely registered it. The bear stood just outside the doorway, its thick fur dusted with frost, its breath visible in the frigid air. Its sheer size should have triggered instinctive fear, but there was something about the way it stood, calm, deliberate, that held her frozen in place. The bear did not lunge. It did not growl. It did not retreat. It simply stared at her. Its massive paws remained planted firmly on the wooden porch, as though waiting for something. Jake muttered a curse under his breath, reaching for the radio. Emily knew she should close the door. Now, but she didn't move. She saw something in the bear's expression, something beyond primal instinct, something pleading. The bear shifted its weight slightly, huffing. Then it raised one massive paw and placed it against the doorframe. A knock, a deliberate, unmistakable knock. The station remained silent, except for Carla's breathless whisper from behind them. "What the hell?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had lived in these mountains long enough to know that bears didn't behave this way. Bears avoided humans, and when they did approach, it was out of desperation. Food, injury, confusion. But this bear wasn't rummaging through garbage cans. It wasn't growling in hunger. It was asking for something.
It was trying to communicate. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her slightly back. "Em, we have to call animal control. That thing shouldn't be here." The bear made a low sound, almost like a groan, and stepped back slightly, but it didn't leave. Instead, it turned its massive head toward the tree line at the edge of town, then back to Emily. It took a few steps, paused, looked at her again. It wanted her to follow. Her training told her this was reckless, unpredictable, dangerous, but her gut told her something else. "I think it's trying to show us something," she murmured, ignoring Jake's exasperated scoff. "Oh, come on. It's a bear, Emily, not some trained rescue dog." But even as he said it, even as Carla continued to murmur nervously behind them, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this moment mattered, that if she let the bear go now, she might never know why it had come in the first place. Taking a breath, she stepped onto the porch, feeling the shift in the bear's posture immediately. It watched her, waiting. "Stay inside," she said over her shoulder. Just give me a second, Emily." But she was already moving. The bear turned and started walking, slow enough that she could keep up, its massive paws crunching over the frost-hardened ground. She followed, her hand hovering near the radio on her shoulder, ready to call in backup if needed. The bear moved with purpose, pausing every so often to look back at her, making sure she was still there. They reached the edge of the woods, and the bear stopped. It huffed again, lowering its head toward the ground. Emily hesitated, then took a cautious step forward. That's when she saw it, a piece of torn fabric, half buried in the frost-covered leaves. Her stomach tightened. It was human clothing. She crouched down, brushing aside the debris to reveal a jacket sleeve, the material stiff with frozen moisture. Her mind raced. A lost hiker? A hunter? Someone injured? She lifted the fabric, scanning the ground for footprints, for any further clues. When she looked up, the bear was watching her intently. "Who are you trying to lead me to?" she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. The bear gave another huff, then turned slightly, moving deeper into the trees before pausing to glance back at her. The message was clear: "Follow me." Emily swallowed, pressing the button on her radio. "Jake, I need backup. I think we have a missing person situation." There was silence, then Jake's voice, tight with frustration. "You've got to be kidding me. Just trust me," she said, already stepping forward. The bear, satisfied, continued into the forest, and Emily followed. Emily pushed forward through the underbrush, her boots crunching against the frost-covered ground as she followed the enormous brown bear. Deeper into the forest, the icy air stung her cheeks, but she barely noticed, her entire focus locked on the hulking figure moving ahead of her. The bear wasn't charging or meandering like a wild animal normally would. Its movements were intentional, precise, as if it had a mission. Emily's heart pounded, her radio crackling in the silence as Jake's voice came through. Tense and skeptical. "Emily, you need to turn around. Now. Whatever you think this bear is doing, it's still a bear. You're alone in the woods, following a predator." She ignored the sharp edge in his tone, her grip tightening around the radio. "I'm telling you, Jake, this isn't normal behavior. I found a torn jacket back there. Someone might be in trouble." The line was quiet for a moment, and then, with a sigh, he relented. "Fine, I'm on my way. But for the love of God, don't let that thing out of your sight." She barely acknowledged his words, her entire body tense as she kept pace with the bear. It moved effortlessly despite its size, navigating fallen logs and snow-dusted undergrowth as if it knew the path well. Emily had hiked through these woods before, but never this deep, and certainly not under these circumstances. The town sat nestled at the base of the mountain, but beyond the well-worn trails, the wilderness stretched on for miles, dangerous, unmarked terrain that could easily swallow a person whole. If someone was out here alone, injured, time was running out. The bear suddenly stopped, lifting its massive head to sniff the air. Emily froze, instinct telling her that something significant was about to happen. The forest was eerily silent, no rustling of squirrels, no distant chirps from winter birds. The quiet was unnatural, almost suffocating. She took a slow, steady breath, forcing herself to stay calm. The bear turned its massive head toward her, huffing out a visible breath into the cold air. Then, without hesitation, it moved again, picking up speed. Emily quickened her pace, pushing through tangled branches and uneven terrain, her boots slipping slightly on the frozen ground. The trees stretched high above her, their skeletal branches swaying slightly in the wind. And for the first time since stepping into the woods, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. Was she making a mistake? Was she reading too much into an animal's strange behavior? But then the bear let out a deep, guttural noise, something between a growl and a call. And up ahead, she heard it faint, weak, but unmistakably human. A voice. Emily's breath caught. She bolted forward, her heartbeat hammering in her ears as she reached a small clearing. The bear had stopped at the edge of a ravine, its massive paws shifting uneasily against the rocky ledge. Emily skidded to a halt, chest heaving, and peered over the edge, her stomach twisted at the sight below. A man lay sprawled against the jagged rocks, his body half buried in a patch of snow, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, lips tinged blue, eyes barely open. He was alive but barely. "Officer," the man's voice was barely more than a whisper, hoarse and weak. "Help." Emily was already moving, her training kicking in as she grabbed her radio. "I found him," she said breathlessly. "Male, late 30s, severe hypothermia, possible leg fracture, responsive but weak. I need search and rescue at my location ASAP." Jake's response came through, sharper now, all traces of skepticism gone. "Sending coordinates to Sarnau. Hang tight." Emily dropped to her knees at the edge of the ravine, assessing the situation. The drop wasn't insurmountable, but the terrain was dangerous, the rocks slick with ice. She could climb down, but getting back up with an injured man would be another challenge altogether. She turned her attention back to the bear, who was pacing slightly, letting out occasional low rumbles as it watched the man below. There was no mistaking it now. This animal had led her here with purpose. "Hey, stay with me," she called down, carefully lowering herself onto a more stable section of the slope. "What's your name?" The man's head lolled slightly, his breathing shallow. "Daniel," he mumbled. "Daniel Hughes." Emily felt a jolt of recognition. She knew that name. Daniel was a seasoned hiker, well known among the locals for his deep knowledge of the mountain trails. What the hell had happened to leave him stranded like this? She edged closer, sliding carefully down the incline. "Okay, Daniel, I need you to stay awake. Can you tell me what happened?" Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "Fell 2 days ago. Wasn't sure if anyone would find me." His gaze flickered to the bear above them, a small, knowing smile ghosting his lips. "Guess I was wrong." Emily's throat tightened. She crouched beside him, assessing the damage. His leg was definitely broken, and his fingers were stiff with cold. But he was still conscious. That was a good sign. She tugged off her gloves, pressing her fingers against his wrist to check his pulse. "Weak but steady. You're lucky," she murmured, glancing back up at the bear, who remained vigilant. "You have a friend looking out for you." Daniel let out a weak chuckle. "Bruno." Emily blinked. "What?" He exhaled, his breath shaky. "The bear. His name is Bruno." He winced, shifting slightly. "I've known him for years. Fed him sometimes, patched him up when he got caught in traps. Never thought he'd return the favor." Emily stared at him, her mind struggling to process the weight of what he was saying. This wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. This bear had a bond with Daniel, one strong enough that it had sought help when he needed it most. A crackle of static sounded from her radio, snapping her back to reality. "SAR is en route," Jake's voice confirmed. 10 minutes out. Emily nodded to herself, gripping Daniel's shoulder gently. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Daniel gave a small nod, his eyelids fluttering. "Don't let them hurt him," he whispered. "Bruno, he's not just a bear." Emily followed his gaze back up to the ledge, where Bruno stood like a silent guardian, his massive frame outlined against the overcast sky. She felt a deep, unshakable certainty settle in her chest. This was no ordinary rescue. This was something else entirely, a story of trust, of loyalty, of a connection that defied logic. As the sound of approaching rescue teams echoed through the trees, Emily made a silent vow. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let Bruno be treated like just another wild animal. He had saved a life, and now it was her turn to return the favor. The whine of an approaching helicopter cut through the silence of the forest, its rhythmic thumping growing louder as the search and rescue team neared the ravine. Emily kept her eyes locked on Daniel, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the tremble of his fingers as they curled into the snow beside him. His breathing had slowed, and she fought against the gnawing fear that hypothermia was tightening its grip. Above them, Bruno remained motionless, a statue of muscle and fur, his dark eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Emily still couldn't wrap her head around at the fact that this bear, an animal that should have no reason to care about human affairs, had not only sought help but had refused to leave his injured friend's side. There was something unshakable in the way Bruno stood watch, something protective, something knowing. She exhaled, forcing her focus back on the rescue at hand. Snow crunched behind her as boots pounded against the frozen ground, and a moment later, Jake's voice broke through the stillness. "Jesus, Emily." She turned to find him standing at the edge of the ravine, panting, his face flushed with equal parts frustration and concern. Behind him, two paramedics and a mountain rescuer hurried to assess the situation. Jake's eyes darted from Daniel's crumpled form to the bear towering above them. His jaw tightened. "Tell me that thing hasn't been standing there the whole damn time." Emily ignored the disbelief in his voice. "We need to stabilize him. His leg is broken, and he's got severe hypothermia. He's been out here for 2 days." She glanced at Bruno again, lowering her voice. "And before you say anything, the bear brought me here." Jake gave her a sharp look, shaking his head as if she'd lost her mind. "The bear brought you here, Emily?" Later, she cut in. her tone brooking no argument. "Right now, we get Daniel out." The paramedics were already moving, preparing a stretcher, setting up stabilizers for his leg. One of them, a woman with dark hair tucked under a beanie, checked Daniel's vitals, frowning at his sluggish response. "He's going to crash soon if we don't get him warm." Jake crouched beside Emily, running a hand down his face. "You seriously want me to believe this bear knew he was in trouble and got help?" She didn't respond immediately, just turned her gaze back toward Bruno. The bear had lowered himself onto all fours, his head tilting slightly, watching their every move. Emily could feel something unspoken in that look, something ancient and intelligent. "I don't care what you believe," she said finally. "He saved him." The rescuers worked quickly, securing Daniel in the stretcher, wrapping him in thermal blankets. As they prepared to hoist him up, the team leader, a grizzled man named Harris, lifted his radio to his mouth. "Chopper's 5 minutes out. We need to clear a landing spot." He turned toward the bear, his brow furrowing. "We have a problem, though." Emily stiffened. "What kind of problem?" Harris shot her a pointed look. "That thing." He gestured toward Bruno. "We can't have a bear this close when we're trying to extract a patient. He's unpredictable. Could be a threat." "No," Emily said immediately. "He won't attack." Jake scoffed. "You don't know that." Emily squared her shoulders, stepping between the team and the bear. "He's not a wild bear in the way you're thinking. He's protecting Daniel. He won't leave until he knows he's safe." "That's not how this works," Harris said, sighing. "We're not running an animal sanctuary. We can't risk it." Emily's pulse spiked. She knew where this was heading. If the bear didn't back off, they'd either tranquilize him or worse. The idea of it made her stomach turn. "Let me handle it." Harris hesitated, exchanging a glance with Jake. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. And before she could second-guess herself, she turned fully toward Bruno. The bear watched her approach, his massive frame rising slightly as she stepped forward. Emily had no idea what she was doing, no training for this, no logical reason to believe that the bear would listen. But something deep in her gut told her that logic didn't apply here. Slowly, carefully, she raised a hand, palm outward. "Bruno," she said softly, testing the name Daniel had given him. The bear's ears flicked slightly, but he didn't move away. "He's going to be okay." She took another step. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something she wasn't sure she'd ever understand. "You brought me here. You did what you needed to do. Now we have to take him the rest of the way." For a long moment, Bruno didn't react. Then, slowly, he let out a deep, huffing breath and lowered his head. He stood there for a moment longer before, without any sudden movement. He turned. Emily barely breathed as she watched the massive animal take a few steps back toward the trees, then a few more, and then, like a ghost melting into the snow, he was gone. She exhaled shakily, turning back to see Harris staring at her like she'd just performed an exorcism. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Never seen anything like that." Jake still looked skeptical, but he didn't argue this time. He just ran a hand through his hair and muttered, "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen." The helicopter arrived minutes later, sending a whirlwind of snow into the air as Daniel was lifted into the sky, heading toward safety. Emily watched the chopper disappear over the ridge, then turned back to the forest. Bruno was gone, but she had no doubt he was still watching. As they trekked back toward the station, Jake fell into step beside her. "So," he said after a long moment, "what now?" Emily didn't have an answer, but she had a feeling that this was far from over. The town of Rock Pine had always been quiet, nestled at the base of the mountains, where life moved at an easy, predictable pace. But after the events of the past day, everything felt different. Emily sat in her patrol car outside the hospital, the heater humming softly as warm air rushed against her cold fingers. Inside, Daniel Hughes was recovering. The doctors said he was lucky if he had been out there much longer. Hypothermia would have taken him. But what no one could explain, what no one wanted to acknowledge, was the reason he had survived at all. Bruno, the bear who had done something no wild animal was supposed to do. The bear who had saved him. Emily exhaled, her breath fogging the windshield. The rational part of her mind still struggled with it, but she had seen it with her own eyes. The way Bruno had led her to Daniel, The way he had watched over him, and the way, when she had spoken to him, he had understood. She glanced at the hospital entrance, debating whether to go inside. Daniel had been unconscious when they airlifted him out, and she had yet to speak with him since the rescue. She needed answers. More than that, she needed to understand. Finally making up her mind, she stepped out of the cruiser, the cold biting through her jacket, and walked toward the doors. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. She nodded at the receptionist, who directed her to Daniel's room. As she pushed open the door, she found him sitting upright, his leg in a thick cast, a hospital blanket pulled over him. His face was still pale, but there was a spark of awareness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're the cop," he said, his voice hoarse from days of dehydration. "The one the bear brought." Emily pulled up a chair beside his bed. "And you're the hiker who somehow convinced a bear to save his life." Daniel let out a weak chuckle. "Yeah, that sounds about right." She studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Daniel exhaled, running a tired hand through his unkempt hair. "It started years ago," he said. "Bruno wasn't always this big, you know. The first time I saw him, he was just a cub. His mother had been killed poachers, maybe, or another animal. I found him on the trail, barely alive. I should have left him alone, let nature take its course, but I couldn't. I fed him, left water for him, just enough to keep him going. He started following me whenever I hiked. At first, he kept his distance, but over time, he got closer. It wasn't like taming a pet, he was always wild. But he knew me, trusted me." Emily listened, absorbing every word. "And this bond lasted?" Daniel nodded. "I didn't see him for a long time after that first year. Thought he was gone. But every now and then, he'd show up again, like he was checking in. I'd be hiking, and I'd see him at the ridge, watching. Sometimes I'd leave food if I had extra. And sometimes he'd just walk with me for a while. No aggression, just something else." His eyes darkened slightly. "A few months ago, I found him caught in a trap. Some illegal snare some idiot had left near the river. He was bleeding bad, and he was angry, but when he saw me, he stopped fighting. Let me cut him loose." Emily's stomach clenched. "So he remembered what you did for him?" Daniel gave a slow nod. "Guess he did." His fingers tightened around the blanket. "That day in the ravine, I don't even remember falling. One second, I was walking, and the next, I was at the bottom. I couldn't move. I thought that was it. But then, I saw him. He stayed there, watching me. I passed out a few times, but every time I woke up, he was still there. He tried to nudge me up at one point, but I couldn't move. And then he left. I figured that was the end." His lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. "Didn't realize he was going to get help." Emily shook her head in quiet amazement. "Neither did I." Silence settled between them for a moment before Daniel's expression grew more serious. "What happens now?" Emily exhaled, rubbing her temples. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. People already think bears are dangerous. If word gets out that he was near town, that he was at the station, there's going to be panic. Wildlife authorities will want to relocate him. Or worse." Daniel's jaw tightened. "They can't." "They will," she countered, "unless we do something." Daniel hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "He saved my life. I won't let them treat him like some problem to get rid of." Emily met his gaze. "Then we have to make sure they never see him as a threat." Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed." She stood, pushing back the chair. "Get some rest. We'll figure this out." As she left the room, her mind raced with the weight of what had to come next. Bruno had proven something remarkable, something that challenged everything people thought they knew about animals. But the world wasn't kind to things it didn't understand. And Emily had a feeling this was just the beginning. The sun had barely begun its descent when Emily pulled her patrol car onto the winding road, leading toward the forest's edge. The town of Rockpine lay quiet behind her, unaware of the battle already forming in hushed conversations at the police station and local ranger's office. Reports of a dangerously intelligent bear had started circulating, fueled by whispers of the rescue. It wasn't long before word reached the state wildlife officials, and now they wanted answers. They wanted Bruno. Emily gripped the wheel tighter, her mind racing. She knew how these things went when an animal showed signs of unusual behavior. The answer was almost always the same: relocate or neutralize. And she couldn't let that happen. Bruno wasn't a threat. He was something else entirely. Something the world wasn't ready to understand. She parked near the trailhead, stepping out into the crisp evening air. Daniel was already there, leaning on a crutch, his face drawn but determined. He had barely been out of the hospital a full day, but when she called, he didn't hesitate. "Tell me we have a plan," he said, watching as she approached. Emily exhaled. "The Rangers are coming tomorrow. They'll track him if they can. If they decide he's too close to town." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Daniel's jaw tightened. "So we find him first." She nodded. "We make sure he stays away, at least until this dies down." It was a desperate plan, and they both knew it. Bruno wasn't a dog they could call or leash. He was a wild animal, one who made his own choices. But Emily had to believe that if he could seek help, he could understand danger too. She slung a pack over her shoulder and motioned toward the path. "Let's go." They moved in silence, the forest swallowing them whole as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees. Every crack of a branch, every distant rustle sent a jolt of awareness through Emily's body. She knew Bruno was near. She could feel it. The only question was whether he would come to them or if they would have to search for him. In the vast expanse of wilderness, Daniel limped beside her, his face lined with exhaustion, but his resolve unshaken. "You think he knows?" he murmured. Emily glanced at him. "About the Rangers?" He nodded. She considered it. Bruno had proven he wasn't just another bear. He had watched, learned, understood more than any animal had a right to. But would he recognize the threat for what it was? Would he know that the very humans he had turned to for help might be the ones to end his freedom? "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think he trusts us, and that's enough." They pressed on, following the ridge that overlooked the valley where Daniel had fallen. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, mingled with something faintly musky. A presence. Emily slowed, her heart pounding. And then, just beyond the thicket, a shadow moved. A massive, familiar shape emerged from the trees, golden brown for catching the last light of the sun. Bruno. He stood still, watching them, his dark eyes unreadable yet piercingly aware. Emily took a careful step forward, her hands open, her voice calm. "Hey, big guy." The bear huffed, nostrils flaring as if assessing their intent. He didn't move toward them, but he didn't run either. It was a choice, she realized. He was waiting. Daniel, ignoring his injury, stepped closer. "Bruno," he said, his voice carrying something raw, something grateful. "You saved me." The bear let out a low rumble, something between a growl and a sigh, before shifting his weight, his massive paws pressing into the dirt. Emily swallowed hard, stepping beside Daniel. "You can't stay here," she said softly, almost pleading. "People are coming. People who won't understand." Bruno's ears flicked, and for a moment, Emily swore she saw recognition in his eyes. He huffed again, turning his head toward the valley, toward the deeper wilderness that stretched for miles beyond the town's reach. A path he had once walked, a path he could walk again. Daniel exhaled. "You have to go, buddy." The bear didn't move right away. He lingered, watching them, as if making a decision neither of them could comprehend. Then, slowly, he turned. His powerful body shifted, muscles rippling beneath thick fur as he took a step away. Then another. The finality of it settled in Emily's chest like a weight. He was leaving. She should have felt relief. This was what they wanted, wasn't it? But as Bruno paused one last time, looking back over his shoulder, she felt something else. Loss. Then, with a final huff, he disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the vastness of the wild. Daniel let out a shaky breath. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Emily forced a small smile. "He survived before. He'll survive again." They stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness where their guardian had vanished. The forest was silent once more, as if it had closed itself around its secret, sealing Bruno's story away. Emily knew they had done the right thing, but as they turned back toward town, she also knew that part of her would always wonder, would he ever return? Or had they just said goodbye forever?